Now it's time for today's perspective. And if you're trying to get information out of someone, how do you go about it? Well, perhaps with the bribe of a cup of coffee or return of a bit of gossip back in the other direction. But if that information you're seeking, though, is perhaps for your work or to do sometimes with personal or private information, it can often be a little difficult, especially if you don't know the person and have no relationship of trust with them. Well, one book might help you. My guest today is author of The Interloper, Lessons from Resistance in the Field. Michel Anteby is Professor of Management and Organizations at Sociology at Boston University. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I mean, the book is written, isn't it, for field researchers out and about trying to research their subject, often very difficult. What is the overall advice that you would give to researchers embarking on the project?
So usually researchers complain about not getting access, and I would really encourage them to embrace all the obstacles and hurdles they face. In a way, not try to move away, but just run with it. And I learned this through many field sites I've done, including ghostwriters, clinical anatomists, Harvard professors, and many more.
And presumably it's what you have to do with that person is build up some kind of relationship of trust?
So I think you have to build trust, but you also have to be attuned to why you're getting pushback and the kind of pushback you're getting, because pushback is in itself information that you can actually learn from. The first time I noticed this was in an aeronautic plant in France when I was doing my dissertation. So this goes way back. And people were very uncomfortable with my coming from the US to study them. So the pushback I was getting was around my nationality, and that became crucial to the plant itself later on in the study.
So how do you get over that then?
So you, I think, revamp yourself as someone else. In this case, I became much more French than I thought I was, I think, and tried to distance myself as much as I could from my US affiliation.
It takes time to do that kind of thing, though, doesn't it? To kind of work on people, to get them to have a relationship with you.
So it takes time, but that's the beauty of fieldwork. And that's really what our jobs as sociologists or scholars is about. So the time we spend doing this before we think we have access is actually an access in itself and teaches us a lot about them.
We were talking just before we came on air. I mean, the book, as we say, is about fieldwork, but it does apply, doesn't it, to so many other situations, just other situations that ordinary people would have in their everyday lives.
Right. So we, not all of us professionally study others, but I would argue many of us enter new worlds constantly. And trying to pick up on what these new worlds are about is difficult. In one instance, when I was working with a colleague on ghostwriters, they would constantly deny that they'd ghostwritten books, even though we had massive evidence showing that that was the case. And slowly we learned that this denial was a way for them to construct their world, because they didn't see themselves as ghostwriters, but they actually imagined themselves as co-writers with the talent of a third person that wasn't them nor the talent. So that pushback is really what we're trying to identify. And I'm guessing many people can relate to this.
And presumably once you've done the research and it's been published, often do you get feedback from people, I assume, often very critical and very upset with the research you've done, or perhaps embracing it?
So, what always strikes me is that there aren't too many surprises when you get feedback, because the reaction you get is very similar to the one you got when you were doing the research. When you get pushback, that's silence, for instance. I published the book on Harvard Business School, and there was massive silence from the school around the publication of the book. So the reaction is also an echo of what happened earlier in some ways.
How do you smell a rat? I mean, if somebody is obviously lying to you, or perhaps not so obviously lying to you, how can you work on that and realize that actually what they're saying isn't the case?
I mean, as a journalist, you probably know this better than anyone. I think what I try to do is to derail kind of the flow of conversation, especially the more polished and professional people are, the more articulate they are about the view of the world that they enjoy. So trying to insert questions to derail is really important, and also showcasing that when you're being played with, right? And these are moments where you would signal, for instance, when I was working with clinical anatomists who were trying to secure cadavers for their hospitals, and they would tell me that they only got cadavers from one location, I could pinpoint, but I thought you got something from elsewhere, right? So signaling also your knowledge of the field is critical.
So it's doing the research before you talk to somebody, ideally.
Doing the research, derailing the conversation if you can, and I hope I'm not doing it right now, by the way.
I'd spot it if you were.
Thanks. And also trying also to, jump with anything that's of concern to them, not you. So honing in on anything that's attention for them is really important as a skill set.
You also talk in the book, don't you, about how if you're trying to investigate a group of people or an organisation and they start trying to derail or lie, often it sort of folds back on them and doesn't work out the best way for them because you find out a lot more in a way.
Yeah. So the beauty of the pushback is that it actually reveals way more than people imagine. So the more you get pushback, the more you actually realize what's happening behind the veil. And if you can identify patterns, then all the better, because you know exactly where the difficulty lies and how you can maybe try to re-enter through another door.
So what would be your advice, say, to a company or a group of people if they do get approached by researchers and they're asking questions? Would the advice be to try and cooperate as much as possible rather than slam the door in people's faces?
I do believe we can bring a lot to different companies and organizations. They're often concerned about their image, but we can handle this by, doing non-disclosure agreements, hiding their name, etc. So I would say embrace it. React as you normally do, because that will be diagnostic of how you are. Don't hide yourself. Don't try to be silent. Just behave as you are and let people do their work around you.
And what reaction have you had to the book? I mean, have you had people kind of reading it and going, either saying, well, this is sort of obvious, or saying, actually, there's so much in here that I've not thought about, and this is really going to help me?
My sense is people discard pushback very easily. So, I've gotten comments from colleagues who've done their careers around specific topics without realizing why they were probably good at what they were doing because of the pushback they were receiving. In my case, I like resistance because my background makes me well attuned to it. One of my colleagues, for instance, studies men in high power position. She grew up in a Mormon family and is really comfortable with men in power, and realized that the pushback she was getting from these men was actually indicative of their insecurity in being in power. So others probably can also realize what they're dealing with through pushback.
Okay, well, it sounds like a fascinating read. Thanks very much for coming in and telling us about it today. Michel Anteby is a Professor of Management and Organisations and Sociology at Boston University, giving a talk a few days ago, in fact, at Sciences Po University here in Paris. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.